For many years, Daystar stood as one of the most recognizable names in Christian broadcasting. To its loyal audience, it was more than a television network. It was a spiritual home, a daily source of prayer, encouragement, teaching, and hope. Viewers tuned in not simply for content but for connection. They believed they were participating in something larger than themselves, a ministry that represented faith, healing, revival, and divine guidance. But in recent months, that image has come under intense scrutiny. What began as quiet viewer concern over JONI Lamb's recent on-air appearances has evolved into a much broader conversation about transparency, leadership credibility, donor accountability, and the future of Daystar itself. For longtime supporters, the questions are no longer limited to what they are seeing on the screen. The larger issue has become what they believe they are not being told. This is not merely a story about visible health concerns. It is a story about trust. And once trust begins to fracture inside a donor-funded religious institution, every unanswered question becomes magnified. For decades, Daystar carefully cultivated a public image built on spiritual certainty. Its broadcasts often centered on prayer, revival, divine healing, faith declarations, and biblical encouragement. The tone was confident and polished. The network positioned itself as a guiding voice for millions of believers around the world. That history is precisely why the current concerns have landed with such force. Many viewers who have followed the ministry for years say they began noticing visible changes during recent broadcasts.
Glad that God has appointed a time for us to be together, so thank you for opening up your heart, your home, your phone, and enjoy what God has. And with me, of course, is my favorite person, JONI Lamb.
Hello.
How you doing, babe?
I'm doing good, and you know that number is always on the screen because we're available if you need prayer, okay?
Some pointed to what they perceived as fatigue, physical strain, or noticeable differences in JONI Lamb's appearance and demeanor. In any other context, such observations might have remained personal speculation. But because this concerns the president and public face of a major global Christian network, the conversation quickly expanded. For supporters, the concern was not only personal sympathy. It was institutional. People who have financially supported the ministry for years began asking whether leadership had a responsibility to communicate more openly. Their argument is rooted in the unique nature of donor-funded religious organizations. Unlike ordinary media companies, ministries ask supporters to invest emotionally, spiritually, and financially. Viewers are regularly encouraged to see themselves as partners in a divine mission. That partnership creates expectations. When visible concerns arise around leadership, many supporters believe they deserve clarity. In their view, transparency is not optional, it is part of stewardship. This is where the Daystar situation becomes especially significant. The issue is no longer simply about health speculation. It has become a test of whether the network's leadership understands the fragile nature of public trust. In religious institutions, trust is often inseparable from moral authority. A ministry's message depends heavily on the credibility of its leaders. When those leaders regularly speak on healing, restoration, faith, and integrity, audiences naturally expect those same principles to guide how internal crises are handled. Critics argue that Daystar's response has failed to meet that standard. According to many online commentators and former supporters, the explanations that have circulated publicly, whether framed as temporary illness, fatigue, or minor medical issues, have not fully addressed the visible concerns viewers believe they are seeing. The result is an atmosphere of growing skepticism. In the absence of direct and detailed communication, audiences often fill the silence with speculation. This pattern is not unique to Daystar. It is a recurring feature of public leadership crises across politics, business, entertainment, and religious institutions. Silence creates space for narratives. Once that process begins, even small details can become symbols of larger distrust. For Daystar, this dynamic is intensified by the fact that the network has already faced significant controversy in recent years. Family disputes, leadership tensions, and corporate questions have already shaped public perception. For some viewers, the current concerns are being interpreted through that broader context. This matters deeply. Public trust rarely collapses because of one isolated event. More often, it erodes through accumulation. One unanswered question leads to another. One unresolved controversy makes the next issue feel larger. One moment of silence begins to look like a pattern. That is exactly what many critics now claim is happening. Conversation has also intensified around the broader issue of privacy versus accountability. This is one of the most difficult dimensions of the story. On one hand, medical matters are deeply personal. No public figure automatically loses every right to privacy simply because they hold a leadership role. On the other hand, leaders of major ministries occupy a unique space. They are not private citizens in the ordinary sense. They lead organizations built on donor trust, spiritual authority, and moral credibility. When their personal circumstances visibly affect the institution, supporters often feel justified in asking questions. This tension between privacy and accountability sits at the heart of the Daystar debate. Supporters defending leadership argue that critics have crossed ethical boundaries by turning visible concerns into public controversy. Critics respond that transparency is necessary because Daystar has long asked viewers to trust its leadership with spiritual guidance and financial support. Both positions reflect genuine concerns. But from an institutional perspective, perception often matters as much as fact. Even if leadership believes it is acting appropriately, the appearance of distance or withholding can still damage credibility. This is especially true in ministries where leaders routinely preach honesty, openness, healing, and faith. Any perceived gap between message and conduct becomes highly consequential. That perceived inconsistency is what many critics now describe as hypocrisy. Criticism extends beyond the immediate health concerns. For many observers, the current moment has become inseparable from ongoing questions surrounding family controversy and leadership succession. JONI Lamb's marriage to Doug Weiss has become a major focus of public scrutiny. Critics argue that the speed, optics, and broader implications of that relationship have contributed to a crisis of confidence. Supporters, by contrast, view such criticism as deeply personal and unfair. Yet in the world of public ministry, personal choices are rarely treated as merely personal. They become symbols. Leadership decisions, family relationships, succession planning, and public appearances all feed into the wider narrative about institutional integrity. This is particularly important because Daystar's influence extends far beyond one program. It is a global broadcasting platform with decades of reach and substantial financial support. When questions arise at the top, they inevitably affect perceptions of the entire network. Donors begin asking whether their contributions are being stewarded responsibly. Viewers begin questioning the credibility of the teaching. Critics begin examining leadership culture. Former supporters revisit older controversies. At that point, the issue ceases to be personal. It becomes structural. This is why the current controversy matters even to those unfamiliar with Daystar itself. It reflects a much larger issue within contemporary religious broadcasting. Modern ministries often function as complex media organizations. They blend spiritual authority with corporate governance. They ask for trust while operating large financial structures. They present highly polished public images while navigating deeply human internal challenges. That combination creates vulnerability. The higher the public platform, the more severe the consequences when credibility begins to weaken. For longtime viewers, the emotional dimension of this story cannot be overstated. Many have invested years of loyalty. Some have given sacrificially. Others have built spiritual routines around the ministry's broadcasts. When concerns emerge, the sense of disappointment can be profound. This is not merely criticism from outsiders. In many cases, it is concern from those who once trusted the institution most deeply. That is why the calls for transparency have grown louder. Supporters want reassurance. They want clarity. They want confidence that leadership understands the seriousness of the moment. The longer uncertainty persists, the more difficult trust becomes to restore. History offers many examples of institutions that underestimated this dynamic. In religious organizations especially, reputational damage often accelerates once supporters begin to interpret silence as avoidance. Even when leadership eventually responds, delayed communication can feel reactive rather than sincere. That distinction matters. Trust is not rebuilt through statements alone. It is rebuilt through consistency, clarity, humility, and visible alignment between what is taught publicly and what is practiced privately. For Daystar, the road ahead will likely depend less on managing criticism and more on addressing the underlying credibility concerns that have emerged. This includes questions about leadership culture, communication standards, governance transparency, and the relationship between personal leadership decisions and institutional stewardship. The broader lesson extends far beyond one network. Any ministry built on public trust must recognize how quickly confidence can erode when communication feels incomplete. Audiences today are more informed, more connected, and more willing to question leadership narratives than ever before. Social media, online commentary, and digital journalism amplify every development. What once might have remained private now becomes part of a global conversation within hours. This reality requires a different standard of leadership communication. Institutions that fail to adapt often find themselves overtaken by speculation. In the final analysis, the Daystar controversy is not simply about one visible concern. It is about the fragile architecture of trust inside modern religious institutions. When trust weakens, every decision is reinterpreted. Every silence is scrutinized. Every explanation is tested. For a ministry built on spiritual authority, that is perhaps the most serious crisis of all. Because in the end, credibility is not sustained by polished broadcasts, public messaging, or reputation alone. It is sustained by the confidence people have that leadership is willing to be as transparent in crisis as it is persuasive in preaching. And that is the question many viewers are now asking with growing urgency.